Hi there, my name's James Kelly and welcome back to Scot Goes Pop. And the big news is that John Swinney has set out in more detail than before his roadmap to independence. And he's insisting that independence can only happen via a referendum. And he's also insisting, and this is completely new, that a referendum can and will only happen if the SNP win a majority of seats on their own in the Scottish Parliament next year. So in other words, a pro-independence majority involving the SNP and the Greens would not be sufficient. Now, I suppose in a sense, this answers the question of, well, why should begging for a Section 30 order be any different this time? If we've done that before and it hasn't worked, if Westminster have said no, why should it be any different this time? And the argument is, well, on those previous occasions where our Section 30 has been rejected, we didn't have a single party SNP majority. And so if we do have that this time, then that is why it might be different. The pressure on the UK government to agree this time might be too great for them to resist. However, there are all sorts of problems with this. And the first is that a single party SNP majority in the current circumstances is quite simply unachievable. If you think back to 2021, when the SNP got 48% of the constituency vote under Nicola Sturgeon, which is something that the vast majority of political parties across Western Europe would not be able to achieve. That is an absolutely astonishing performance, and yet the SNP, with that performance, fell short of a majority. They are now polling well short of where they were in 2021, low 30s rather than high 40s. So if they couldn't do it in 2021, they're not going to do it now. There isn't going to be a sufficient turnaround. I know people will say there was a big turnaround in 2011, but the circumstances were completely different. Back then, the SNP had only been in power for 4 years. They hadn't been the sort of build-up of public disaffection. I mean, we've seen in terms of policy delivery that the SNP government have relatively poor ratings. That isn't going to stop them becoming the leading party next year. It's unlikely to stop them, but it is pretty much going to prohibit any possibility of the SNP winning a single party majority. It's just not realistic to think that's going to happen. Now, John Swinney is an intelligent enough man. He's a seasoned enough political campaigner to understand that perfectly well. So, and I say this with the greatest of regret, it's impossible to escape the conclusion that he's setting people a false prospectus. He's deliberately setting an unattainable target, which he thinks will benefit the SNP because he thinks it will, trying to push towards this target, will galvanise the independent support behind the SNP and win them more seats than they otherwise would have won, giving them a stronger minority in the Scottish Parliament, but not a majority. And he's doing this with no thought or with no care to the damage he's going to cause to the independence cause while it helps the SNP. Because, of course, if you've said that a single party SNP majority is required for a referendum, if you don't get that, and he won't get that, the UK government will then turn around and say, right, by your own standards, by the threshold you have set yourself, independence and a referendum is now completely off the agenda for the next 5 years. Even though possibly the Scottish people would actually have voted for it by electing a majority composed of the SNP and the Greens in combination, both pro-independence parties, both pro-referendum parties. So if the SNP themselves aren't going to respect an exercise in self-determination by the Scottish people, and that seems to be John Swinney's position, effectively, then why should the UK government respect it? And why should they respect it in future elections either, now that the SNP have set this precedent by setting this foolish, unattainable threshold? Because it may well be that the SNP will never win a single party majority ever again. When Alex Salmond did it in 2011, it was thought that basically it achieved the impossible because the voting system is basically set up to prevent any single party from winning a majority on its own. So I'm afraid to say that if independence is ever going to happen, this position that John Swinney has just set out is going to have to be reversed. And I say that with tremendous regret, because having only rejoined the SNP only a few months ago, it would have been really nice just to fall in behind the leadership strategy and say, well, it may not be perfect, but it's worth giving this a go. But this is not worth giving a go. I didn't see this coming. It's a complete bolt from the blue. It's not workable. It's against every principle of self-determination. It's going to have to be reversed. But the process of reversing it, let me be clear, is going to have to happen from within the SNP. The Alba Party is not going to ride to the rescue. They are a complete shambles. They're not going to win any seats. Liberate Scotland are not going to ride to the rescue. They're an even bigger shambles. They're not going to win any seats. Certainly none of the unionist parties are going to ride to the rescue. Voting unionist gives you more unions. I mean, it should be a statement of the obvious, and yet there are one or two people who we all know who are advising the crazy idea of trying to solve the situation by voting unionists. No, that won't work. The situation can only be resolved from within the SNP, and it's going to be hard, but we're going to have to try to reverse what has just been announced today. We're going to have to get back to a position of, however we're going to achieve independence, it's going to have to be done via a majority that can be comprised of more than one party, because realistically that's the only pro-independence majority we're ever going to get, certainly next year and maybe forever. And we just have to live with the real world. We can't sort of say, oh, well, it would be lovely, of course, if the SNP were winning outright majorities under a proportional representation system, but let's be serious, it's unlikely to happen. Anyway, so that's my bracing verdict for today. And if you're enjoying this content, please subscribe to my YouTube channel if you haven't already. That would be really helpful. But bye for now.